At what point does the brand step in and go, right, we're opening a lawsuit against you because of you've said that this brand fits this car and we're pricing it differently? Like, at what point does that happen? We don't.
There are moments in any industry where the rules quietly shift. Not with a press conference. Not with a viral campaign. Just a quiet crack in the foundation. And then, suddenly, something that was always assumed to be permanent stops being true. What happened between Koenigsegg and Matt Armstrong is one of those moments. And the reason it hit so hard, the reason comment sections exploded and automotive forums ran with it for weeks, is because it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the wreckage of something else entirely. To understand why a small package from Sweden shook the automotive creator world, you need to first understand the world it landed in. And that world, at the time, was still processing what had unfolded around Bugatti. A story that wasn't just about one car or one creator, but about the relationship between legacy manufacturers and the people who love their products more publicly than the brands themselves sometimes want. Bugatti is a name that carries more mythology per horsepower than almost any other manufacturer on Earth. The Veyron rewrote what people believed was possible in a road car. The Chiron made that achievement look modest. And the exclusivity surrounding both has always been part of the point. You don't just buy a Bugatti. You are selected for one. You are assessed. Approved. And if Bugatti decides, at any point, that you are not the right custodian of their engineering, well, that decision is theirs to make, and they've made it before. What bubbled into public consciousness recently was a case involving a creator, someone with a substantial, genuinely passionate following in the automotive space, who found themselves on the wrong end of that approval process. The details shifted slightly depending on the source, but the architecture of the story was consistent. A content creator, the kind of person who had spent years building an audience that loved cars not as status symbols but as machines, as problems to understand, as engineering to admire, found the doors of Bugatti's world closing rather than opening. Not because of scandal. Not because of legal trouble. But because of image. Because the way that creator engaged with cars, publicly, didn't match the carefully curated environment Bugatti wants to exist around their product. To be clear about what this means in practice, Bugatti and brands like it have long operated with what you might call a velvet blacklist. It's never published. It's never explained in full. But it functions as a very real filter that determines who gets proximity to the brand, who gets factory tours, who gets invited to press launches, who gets to be photographers near a Chiron, and perhaps most significantly, who gets to purchase one. When a creator falls outside that filter, the consequences are practical and immediate. Access disappears. Relationships dry up. The machine continues, and they are simply no longer part of it. For Matt Armstrong, watching this play out publicly wasn't a distant news story. It was a mirror. Because Matt had been living a quieter version of the same dynamic for years, pouring extraordinary resources into rebuilding cars from manufacturers who had never once acknowledged his existence. If you've followed Matt's channel with any seriousness, you understand the scale of what he does. This is not a person who buys a sports car, drives it fast, and talks about how it feels. What Matt does is closer to surgery. He acquires cars that the market has written off, wrecked, written off by insurers, considered beyond saving, and he brings them back. Not with replica parts. Not with workarounds. With genuine, factory-sourced components, sourced at enormous cost and effort, documented on camera with a level of technical transparency that most manufacturer training videos don't approach. The Lamborghini Redefining project alone would have been career-defining for most creators. There are fewer than 24 of those cars in the world. Matt acquired a damaged example and committed to a full restoration that required hunting down parts from a supply chain that was never designed to serve the aftermarket. Because Lamborghini never imagined these cars would need independent restoration. The cost was staggering. The content was extraordinary. And the audience it brought to Lamborghini's engineering, the conversation it created among millions of people who would spend the rest of their lives thinking about that car, Lamborghini said nothing. The Ferrari 296 GTB project was, in some ways, even more striking because of how technically ambitious it was. This is a hybrid hypercar that sits at the absolute frontier of what Ferrari currently builds for the road. Even within official Ferrari service networks, the complexity of this vehicle creates challenges. Matt was rebuilding one, on camera, explaining every system as he went, sourcing OEM parts, and pulling in an audience of people who were learning about Ferrari engineering in real time. Ferrari's response was the same as Lamborghini's. Total silence. Now, it would be unfair to say these manufacturers owe creators anything. They don't. Their cars exist independently of YouTube channels. Their engineering doesn't require an audience to be valid. But when you stand back and look at the full picture, the hours of content, the millions of views, the conversations generated, the younger audiences encountering these brands for the first time through Matt's rebuilds, the silence becomes harder to defend as neutral. It starts to look like a choice. And the Bugatti drama, when it broke into public conversation, made that choice impossible to ignore. Matt Armstrong is not, by reputation or by evidence, someone who leads with emotion. You watch his content and you see someone methodical. Someone who approaches problems with patience and curiosity. Someone who, when things go wrong, and in hypercar restoration, things always go wrong, finds a way through rather than a way out. That temperament is part of what makes his content compelling. You trust him because he doesn't dramatize. So when Matt reacted to a particular package arriving at his workshop the way he did, people noticed. The package had come from Ängelholm, in southern Sweden. For most people, that city doesn't register as significant. For anyone who follows the hypercar world seriously, it registers immediately. Ängelholm is where Koenigsegg builds their cars. And not in a sprawling, industrialized sense. Koenigsegg operates out of a converted military airbase, a facility that functions more like an exceptionally precise studio than a factory. The address on that package meant something before the box was even opened. Inside was merchandise. Not the kind of merchandise that comes from a gift shop or a brand partnerships department running through a checklist. Koenigsegg doesn't really do retail merchandise. They produce too few cars, occupy too specific a cultural space, and operate on a scale where mass consumer products don't really make sense. The hoodies and shirts in that box were the kind of items that, in the ordinary course of events, might find their way to someone who had just taken delivery of a car worth more than most people's homes. They were not influencer package merchandise. They were something else. And then there was the note. Handwritten. Not a form letter. Not a template message from a communications team. A handwritten note that told Matt to watch specific Koenigsegg videos. That single detail, specific videos, changes the character of the entire gesture. Because it means someone at that company in Sweden had watched Matt's content carefully enough to know which of their own content he would find genuinely interesting. This was not a brand reaching outward blindly. This was a brand that had done its homework, identified a specific person, and made a deliberate, individualized decision to reach out. To understand why this move makes complete sense when you know Koenigsegg, you have to spend some time with Christian von Koenigsegg, the founder, and perhaps the most unusual senior figure in the entire automotive industry. Christian started building cars in his early 20s with no engineering degree, no inherited business, and no particular reason to believe he could succeed by any conventional analysis. What he had was an obsession with understanding how things worked and an absolute refusal to accept that the fastest, most technically ambitious road car in the world couldn't come from Sweden. Over 3 decades, he turned that obsession into an organization that now holds multiple world speed records, has developed engine technology that the entire industry watches closely, and produces cars that are, by virtually any engineering measure, among the most sophisticated objects that human hands currently build. The free-valve system, a camshaft-free engine architecture that Koenigsegg developed, represents a fundamental rethinking of how internal combustion works. The light-speed transmission shifts gears faster than any comparable system in existence. The Jesko Absolut is theoretically capable of speeds that no production car has ever achieved in a controlled test. These are not incremental improvements on existing ideas. These are departures. And Christian von Koenigsegg, unlike the heads of Ferrari or Lamborghini, will sit in front of a camera and explain all of it. In detail. He talks about tolerances. He talks about thermodynamics. He talks about the specific engineering problems they encountered and how they were solved. He appears on podcasts hosted by engineers and enthusiasts, not just automotive journalists. He is, in the truest sense, A person who makes things and wants other people to understand what they've made. When you put that temperament alongside Matt Armstrong's content, the deep mechanical dives, the genuine respect for engineering, the audience that comes to learn rather than just to be entertained, the connection is almost inevitable. The surprise isn't that Koenigsegg reached out to Matt. The surprise is that it took this long. And the timing, landing as it did in the wake of the Bugatti controversy, gave it a resonance that a package arriving 6 months earlier wouldn't have had. There is a defensive argument you could make for Ferrari and Lamborghini. You could say that a car being stripped apart on YouTube, however skillfully, risks demystifying a product whose mystique is part of its commercial proposition. You could argue that the kind of audience Matt builds, technically curious, deep diving, wanting to understand the nuts and bolts, is not the audience that buys a Huracan or a 296 GTB. You could make the case that ignoring independent rebuilders is simply a rational protection of brand architecture. The problem with that argument is that it's based on a model of media consumption that no longer exists. The idea that you can protect the mystique of a product by controlling information about it assumes that information can still be controlled, that what consumers know about your engineering is something you can manage. That's not the world we're in. Matt Armstrong's audience already knows how the gearbox works. They already understand what the hybrid system does. The rebuilds happened regardless of whether Lamborghini or Ferrari acknowledged them. What those brands lost was not control of information. They could never have kept that. What they lost was the narrative. By staying silent, they allowed the story of their own engineering to be told without them. Worse, they allowed the story of their indifference to be told, and in the context of the Bugatti situation, that story hit harder than it might have otherwise. Koenigsegg didn't make that mistake. Whether driven by intuition, by strategy, or by a genuine cultural alignment with how Matt operates, probably some combination of all three, they stepped into the narrative rather than away from it. A handful of branded items and a handwritten note. That's the investment. In return, thousands of hours of community discussion, genuine brand curiosity among millions of people who had perhaps given Koenigsegg only passing thought before, and a story that positioned the brand as the intelligent, self-aware alternative to manufacturers who still think exclusivity means closing doors. There is no marketing department on earth that generates that kind of return on that kind of spend. It happened because it was real.